In April 2016, Warriors majority owner Joe Lacob gave an interview with the New York Times. It was mostly to talk about the way that the team was now being run like the companies in nearby Silicon Valley, but it also gave Lacob the opportunity to spread the gospel of how his championship franchise had been built, which he gladly took. This was the interview where Lacob gave the now infamous quote about how the Warriors were light years ahead of the competition. When the interview came out, a lot of people thought these quotes came across as arrogant or self-promoting. Like, okay, Joe, we get it. Your team is super good and you guys did a good job of putting it together. But even if they did sound a little indulgent, it's easy to see why Lacob and the rest of the Warriors brass would feel that level of confidence. The Warriors were preparing to defend their title from the previous year, where they'd won 67 games and never faced elimination in the playoffs, by wrapping up the most dominant regular season in NBA history. And even though they'd end up losing in the finals a couple months later to LeBron's Cavs, it's difficult to make a case that the Warriors weren't the class of the NBA at that point. But rewind the clock to just a few years before that, and the Warriors were nowhere close to being the best team in the league. Before Steph and Klay and Draymond, it was, Corey Maggette? Monte Ellis? Before David Lee finally made it in 2013, the last Warrior to be chosen for an All-Star team was Latrell Sprewell in 1997. For a long time, the Warriors were a lot closer to being the worst team in the league than the best, which begs the question, how the heck did they get from point A to point B? How did a team with one playoff appearance in 18 years suddenly become one of the most dominant teams in NBA history? Well, no matter what Joe Lacob might have you believe, it wasn't really all that sudden, or all that straightforward for that matter, and that's kind of the point. This is the first entry in what will hopefully become a long-standing feature on this channel, called a team-building exercise, where we look at the decision-making processes behind how some of the greatest teams of all time were built. And the 2015 Warriors, what with their 140 wins in 2 seasons, absolutely belong on that list. We're only going to be talking about the first edition of that team, so not the ones with KD on them, because the next 2 title teams were pretty much just this one with a couple of pieces swapped out. But this team in 2014 showcases everything that good team building is about. A coherent plan, a concrete style of play and player that you want the team to have, and last and maybe most importantly of all, a whole heck of a lot of luck. Our main goal for this video will be to look at how the key members of the roster came to be on the roster in the first place, and the decisions behind them getting there. And we're going to start with the best known and most important member of that 2015 championship team, a guy that any NBA franchise would love to start their team with. Festus Ezeli. I'm just kidding, it's Steph. Steph Curry being drafted by the Warriors is a hard decision to evaluate with the benefit of hindsight. Because looking back from today, yeah, all these guys up here are idiots for not picking him. You think the Timberwolves wouldn't bite off someone's hand and not have wound up with Ricky Rubio and Johnny Flynn over him? And Hasheem Thabeet at 3? Ugh. Come on, Grizzlies. You're better than that. Thankfully, they did a lot better the next time they had to pick that high. But the fact of the matter is that Stephen Curry was not a surefire NBA star coming out of college. And there are a few reasons for that. His size was a concern, as was the way he played at Davidson, which was as a ball-dominant, high-volume shooting 2-guard who got to throw up pretty much whatever shot he wanted at any time. He pretty much was Davidson's offense in college, and even with those eye-popping numbers, NBA teams were reticent of spending a high draft pick on a player like that. While three-point shooting numbers across the league were certainly on their way up, they weren't yet to the point that they would be a few years later, incidentally at least partially because of Steph. In 2009, there was still a sense that even if shooting a bunch of threes and spreading teams out made your team more fun to watch, a la the Steve Nash Phoenix Suns, you couldn't actually win that way, which, lol. But this draft was just a couple of weeks after the NBA Finals between the Lakers and the Magic, who Dwight Howard had rebounded, dunked, and blocked all the way to a conference championship. Trends and perceived best practices have a powerful effect on decision-making. And in 2009, if you wanted your team to have a shot at the title, the belief was that you needed a Kevin Garnett or a Tim Duncan. That's why you see Blake Griffin and Hasheem Thabeet at the top of this draft, and then all the guards. But if it's 2009 and you're the Warriors and you kinda suck, but not enough to be in the first 3 or 4 picks, then you might just be looking for a way to put some butts in some seats for next year. And you might think to yourself, hey, you know who seems pretty good and people seem to like? That guy from Davidson. And so it was that just before the Knicks got to pick him at 8 and wound up with Jordan Hill instead, Steph Curry was drafted by the Warriors with the 7th overall pick. He would become one of the greatest shooters and players that the NBA has ever seen, but incidentally, basically none of the coaching staff or front office that drafted him would get to see any of that. This is where Lacob's idea of his Warriors being the industry standard starts to break down a little, because in 2009, he wasn't even the owner of the Warriors yet. The most important piece in his uber-complicated puzzle was drafted and developed by someone else. And even if he had been there, no one could have said with any degree of confidence that they expected Steph Curry to turn into what he has. Was he an amazing player in college? Absolutely, but so was Jimmer Fredette, and that did not turn out in nearly the same way. Although he has had a really excellent career in the Chinese league, so Sunchong Tada Mingzu. To put Steph Curry's development into terms that even Silicon Valley executives would understand, this was sort of like buying Apple stock in the 90s. Sure, the product was already good and worth investing in, but it was about to get way better, like to an extent that no one could have realistically imagined. Because the game was about to change dramatically, and all at once, the Warriors had in their backcourt one of the change's biggest catalysts and one of its biggest beneficiaries. A year after Curry was drafted, our guy Joe Lacob bought the team in 2010 and immediately got to work trying to emulate the organizational genius of his friend and fellow Bay Area executive Billy Beane. Lacob ushered in a new focus on analytics and a dramatic shift from the old school way of doing things to the new, which began with firing NBA coaching legend Don Nelson and replacing him with Keith Smart. We're still like 4 years and 2 more coaches away from Steve Kerr, so again, it bears repeating that the path to success is very rarely a straight line. But one of the most important and unquestionably good decisions that Lacob made came in 2011 when he hired Bob Myers to be the Warriors' assistant GM. Previously a sports agent, Myers was just the kind of young and dynamic executive that would fit the vibe the Warriors were going for and would help build a team around their burgeoning young star. Within a year, Myers would be promoted to GM at the expense of his former boss, Larry Riley, who, in my opinion, does not get enough credit within this narrative. But not before they added another foundational piece to the championship chessboard. Just like Steph Curry, there was another player on that 2015 team from the college ranks who had a famous father and would be another integral step towards where they wanted the franchise to go. James Michael McAdoo. Did he just use the same joke from earlier? Yeah, I did. And so help me God, I'll do it again. But in all seriousness, there would be no Warriors dynasty without the catch-up to Steph's mustard, the barnacle boy to his mermaid man, the other Splash brother, Klay Thompson. In a different era of NBA basketball, this would have been an extremely weird choice. The Warriors already had one trigger-happy guard in their lineup, which was exactly what Thompson appeared to be too. But through their aforementioned forward-thinking approach to analytics, the Warriors were reading the tea leaves and realized that 1, three-pointers were quickly becoming an overpowered shot choice, and 2, that the league was transitioning away from the big man, small man dynamic of the 2000s and towards the kind of dual primary scorer model that we've seen so often since. In the 2011 playoffs, the Celtics and Lakers had both been brushed aside by teams that didn't use a traditional big man, and Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook had gotten the baby Thunder all the way to the conference finals. In years past, the Warriors might have opted for one of the Morris twins or Nikola Vucevic to give their lineup some more diversity, but instead, they doubled down on the three ball. The Warriors' story is one of getting in and getting out at just the right time, and drafting Klay Thompson was no exception. Even though they didn't see much time together in 2011, it was clear by the end of the next season that the Warriors had a very interesting dynamic brewing between their two young stars, who were now shooting over 14 threes a game between the two of them. Steph's ankle was feeling better, as was his sense of financial security, which we'll come back to in a bit, because it's important. But even with the team jacking up threes and quickly becoming every basketball stats nerd's favorite team, they still needed someone to do the dirty work. Enter the league's biggest heel, Draymond Green, who the Warriors got in the second round in 2012. They also got Harrison Barnes in the first, but we don't have to talk about him that much. He's sort of the Mark Brendanowitz of this team. He just exists to be replaced by someone better and more popular later on. Coming out of a season at Michigan State where he'd been selected as a first-team All-American and the Big Ten Player of the Year, Draymond was seen as the ultimate glue guy. Even if he was good at pretty much everything, which he wasn't good enough at any one thing for the teams higher up the draft to pull the trigger on him, which is how he wound up getting picked at 35. This was another instance of the Warriors both being very smart and getting incredibly fortunate. They got a higher ceiling prospect in Barnes with their first pick, and were all too happy to take the high floor guy in Green when he slid to them. Along with Curry and Thompson, all of the foundational pieces were now in place for the Warriors to really create something special. And that's exactly what happened. In 2013, they made the playoffs for the first time since 2007, and all of their bold or controversial moves, from promoting Bob Myers to firing Don Nelson to even getting rid of Monte Ellis, all seemed to be paying off in spades. They made the playoffs again the next year under the guidance of Mark Jackson, the third coach of the Lacob era, But the next year brought a bit of a crossroads. After losing in the first round in a very entertaining series against the Clippers, the Warriors had a decision to make. Try and run it back again the next year, or shake things up and try and take the next step by being proactive. And based on the way that the franchise had been run under Lacob up to this point, you know which one they were always going to choose. On May 6, 2014, the Warriors fired Mark Jackson and replaced him with Steve Kerr, a former NBA star and executive with zero head coaching experience. Maybe that shouldn't have been a surprise from the team that fired an NBA Hall of Fame head coach or traded their best player for Andrew Bogut, but still. Kerr took over a team that had an incredible young core, but through some clever expansion of the roster, it also had a few veterans that could help them take the next step. I mentioned earlier that Steph signed an extension in 2012, but the money involved in that deal really reflected his injury history as much as it did his production. But at the time, his ankles made giving him even that much seem like a risk. And even though his ankles turned out to be fine, for the next couple of years anyway, the financial flexibility that the deal gave the team allowed them to bring in role players like Sean Livingston or Maurice Spates, or even former All-Star Andre Iguodala, who they got in a sign-and-trade deal in 2013. And so the vision that Joe Lacob and his ownership group set out years before was finally realized. They had a core of versatile young talent who all fit their profile, a progressive young coach who could get the most out of them, and a proactive, modern GM to keep it all running smoothly. After years of meticulous team building, the Warriors project finally clicked. That 2014 team won 67 games in the regular season, and their first title in 40 years, and nearly followed that up with another the next season. A cap increase in 2016 led them to being able to sign Kevin Durant, which then led them to winning 2 more titles. At the beginning of the project, the Warriors were listless and lost, and at the end, well, we're not really sure what's going to happen at the end, because this run might not be over yet. After a couple of years of retooling the roster, the Warriors are right back in the mix with a combination of players from the old guard and a new wave of talent they've acquired since. With Steph and Klay, as well as Myers and Kerr still in their positions, it could be a while before the Warriors slide back into obscurity. But going back to Lacob's original quote from 2016, does that mean that the Warriors are actually light years ahead? I think that that's kind of hard to judge, but one thing that I will say is that they've consistently tried to be. Even the use of that phrase, light years ahead, clues you into a lot of the psychology behind their decision-making, which has mostly been to try and make the right decision before everyone else does, or really can even think to. Whether it's shaking up their front office to make it more modern, trying to capitalize on a trend in the game before it's even really happened, the Warriors have taken a kind of Silicon Valley-esque, move fast and break things approach to building this juggernaut. At several points along the way, they sacrificed the good for the sake of the great, because that was what they were striving towards all along. Was there a healthy amount of luck along the way? For sure, but I think that's more the rule for these great teams rather than the exception. You could say the same about the Spurs getting the number 1 overall pick that became Tim Duncan, or the Bulls being able to build a better team around Michael Jordan because of Scottie Pippen's criminally cheap contract. There are so many things that could have prevented a lot of this from happening. Steph could have never fully recovered from his injuries, or they could have never happened in the first place and forced the Warriors to spend more money to re-sign him. They had players take less money to come and play for them, and had opponents lose important players to injury in key playoff series. The Warriors might have been light years ahead of everyone else at various points, but even in that reality, it's fair to say that fate gave them a boost. Whether or not you really believe in what Joe Lacob said, the Warriors are without a doubt one of the greatest success stories of the 21st century NBA. Through a combination of smart draft strategy, a forward-minded style, and a willingness to capitalize on the opportunities that were presented to them, the Warriors built a dynasty. It's hard to say how much another team could look at that series of individual decisions and emulate what they've done, but they could and should aspire to those other things. Team building is just as much an art as it is a science, but one of the most important components to it, across sports and across different eras, is having an identity and sticking to it. And while you may not like that Silicon Valley attitude of being the smartest guy in the room, after 3 titles and maybe another one on the way, you can't say that doing just that didn't work for these guys. Thank you all so much to everyone who made it to the end of this video. Not unlike the journey the Warriors went on, it was a long one with a lot of twists and turns, but we made it. If you enjoyed this content, please let me know by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps to grow the community and bring in new people who might be interested in this stuff too. If you have a team that you'd like for me to do one of these on, please leave them in the comments. I can't say that we'll do them all that often, because honestly they do kind of take a while, but I'd love to do more of them in the future. But like the Warriors front office, I'm always thinking about what comes next. So until the next time I see you, so long, and have a great week.